The power of the Senate expanded over time as the power of the legislative assemblies declined, and the Senate took a greater role in ordinary lawmaking. Its members were usually appointed by Roman censors, who ordinarily selected newly elected magistrates for membership in the Senate, making the Senate a partially elected body. During times of military emergency, such as the civil wars of the 1st century, this practice became less prevalent, as Roman dictator, triumvir or the Senate itself would select its members. Towards the end of the Republic, the Senate could enact a senatus consultum ultimum in times of emergency, instead of appointing a dictator. Legislative assemblies. The Roman Forum, the commercial, cultural, religious, and political center of the city and the Republic, which housed the various offices and meeting places of the government. The legal status of Roman citizenship was limited and a vital prerequisite to possessing many important legal rights, such as the right to trial and appeal, marry, vote, hold office, enter binding contracts, and to special tax exemptions. An adult male citizen with full complement of legal and political rights was called optimogia. The optimo iure elected their assemblies, whereupon the assemblies elected magistrates, enacted legislation, presided over trials in capital cases, declared war and peace, and forged or dissolved treaties. There were two types of legislative assemblies. The first was the comitia, committees, 219, which were assemblies of all optimo iure. The second was the concilia, councils, which were assemblies of specific groups of optimogia. 220. Citizens were organized on the basis of centuries and tribes, which would each gather into their own assemblies. The comitia centuriate assembly, was the assembly of the centuries, i.e. soldiers. The president of the comitia centuriata was usually a consul. The centuries would vote, one at a time, until a measure received support from a majority of the centuries. The comitia centuriata would elect magistrates who had the imperium powers, consuls and praetors. It also elected censors. Only the comitia centuriata could declare war, and ratify the results of a census. 221. It served as the highest court of appealing certain judicial cases. The assembly of the tribes, i.e., the citizens of Rome, the comitia tributa, was presided over by a consul and composed of 35 tribes. The tribes were not ethnic or kinship groups, but rather geographical subdivisions. 222. The order that the tribes would vote in was selected randomly by lot. 223. Once a measure received support from a majority of the tribes, the voting would end. While it did not pass many laws, the comitia tributa did elect quaestus, curule aediles, and military tribunes. 224. The plebeian council, 225, was identical to the assembly of the tribes, but excluded the patricians. They elected their own officers, plebeian tribunes and plebeian aediles. Usually a plebeian tribune would preside over the assembly. This assembly passed most laws, and could act as a court of appeal. Magistrates. Each republican magistrate held certain constitutional powers. Each was assigned a provincia by the Senate. This was the scope of that particular office holder's authority. It could apply to a geographic area or to a particular responsibility or task. 226. The powers of a magistrate came from the people of Rome, both plebeians and patricians. 227. The imperium was held by both consuls and praetors. Strictly speaking, it was the authority to command a military force. In reality, however, it carried broad authority in the other public spheres such as diplomacy, and the justice system. In extreme cases, those with the imperium power were able to sentence Roman citizens to death. All magistrates also had the power of coercion, coercion. This was used by magistrates to maintain public order by imposing punishment for crimes. 228. Magistrates also had both the power and the duty to look for omens. This power could also be used to obstruct political opponents. One check on a magistrate's power was called collegiality. Each magisterial office would be held concurrently by at least 2 people. Another such check was provocatio. While in Rome, all citizens were protected from coercion by provocatio, which was an early form of due process. It was a precursor to habeas corpus. If any magistrate tried to use the powers of the state against a citizen, that citizen could appeal the decision of the magistrate to a tribune. In addition, once a magistrate's 1-year term of office expired, he would have to wait 10 years before serving in that office again. This created problems for some consuls and praetors, and these magistrates would occasionally have their imperium extended. In effect, they would retain the powers of the office, as a pro-magistrate, without officially holding that office. 229. The consuls of the Roman Republic were the highest-ranking ordinary magistrates. Each served for 1 year. 230. They retained several elements of the former kingly regalia, such as the toga praetexta, and fasces, which represented the power to inflict physical punishment. Consular powers included the king's former power to command, imperium, and appointment of new senators. Consuls had supreme power in both civil and military matters. While in the city of Rome, the consuls were the head of the Roman government. They would preside over the Senate and the assemblies. While abroad, each consul would command an army. 231. His authority abroad would be nearly absolute. Praetors administered civil law. 232, and commanded provincial armies. Every 5 years, 2 censors were elected for an 18-month term during which they would conduct a census. During the census, they could enroll citizens in the Senate, or purge them from the Senate. 233. Aediles were officers elected to conduct domestic affairs in Rome, such as managing public games and shows. The quaestus would usually assist the consuls in Rome, and the governors in the provinces. Their duties were often financial. Since the tribunes were considered to be the embodiment of the plebeians, they were sacrosanct. The sacrosanctity was enforced by a pledge, taken by the plebeians, to kill any person who harmed or interfered with the tribune during his term of office. It was a capital offense to harm a tribune, to disregard his veto, or to otherwise interfere with him. 234. In times of military emergency, a dictator would be appointed for a term of 6 months. 235. Constitutional government would be dissolved, and the dictator would be the absolute master of the state. When the dictator's term ended, constitutional government would be restored. Military. Rome's military secured Rome's territory and borders, and helped to impose tribute on conquered peoples. Rome's armies had a formidable reputation, but Rome also produced its share of incompetence, 236, and catastrophic defeats. Nevertheless, it was generally the fate of Rome's greatest enemies, such as Pyrrhus and Hannibal, 237, to win early battles but lose the war. Hoplite armies. During this period, Roman soldiers seem to have been modeled after those of the Etruscans to the north, 238, who themselves are believed to have copied their style of warfare from the Greeks. Traditionally, the introduction of the phalanx formation into the Roman army is ascribed to the city's penultimate king, Servius Tullius, ruled 578-534. 239. The front rank was composed of the wealthiest citizens, who were able to purchase the best equipment. Each subsequent rank consisted of those with less wealth and poorer equipment than the one before it. 240, 241. The phalanx was effective in large, open spaces, but not on the hilly terrain of the central Italian peninsula. In the 4th century, the Romans replaced it with the more flexible manipular formation. This change is sometimes attributed to Marcus Furius Camillus and placed shortly after the Gallic invasion of 390, more likely, it was copied from Rome's Samnite enemies to the south. 242, following the Second Samnite War, 326-304. 243, Manipular Legion. Detail from the Ahinoba bas relief showing, center right, 2 Roman foot soldiers c. 122 BC. Note the Montefortino-style helmets with horsehair plume, chain-mail cuirasses with shoulder reinforcement, oval shields with calfskin covers, gladius and pilum. During this period, an army formation of around 5,000 men, of both heavy and light infantry, was known as a legion. The manipular army was based upon social class, age and military experience. 244. Maniples were units of 120 men each drawn from a single infantry class. They were typically deployed into 3 discrete lines based on the 3 heavy infantry types. The first line maniple were the hastati, leather-armored infantry soldiers who wore a bronze breastplate and a bronze helmet adorned with 3 feathers approximately 30 centimeters, 12 in height, and carried an iron-clad wooden shield. They were armed with a sword and were throwing spears. The second line were the principes. They were armed and armored in the same manner as hastati, but wore a lighter coat of mail rather than a solid brass breastplate. The triartu formed the third line. They were the last remnant of the hoplite-style troops in the Roman army. They were armed and armored like the principes, with the exception that they carried a lighter spear. 245. The 3 infantry classes, 246, may have retained some slight parallel to social divisions within Roman society, but at least officially the 3 lines were based upon age and experience rather than social class. Young, unproven men would serve in the first line, older men with some military experience would serve in the second line, and veteran troops of advanced age and experience would serve in the third line. The heavy infantry of the maniples were supported by a number of light infantry and cavalry troops, typically 300 horsemen per manipular legion. 246. The cavalry was drawn primarily from the richest class of equestrians. There was an additional class of troops who followed the army without specific martial roles and were deployed to the rear of the third line. Their role in accompanying the army was primarily to supply any vacancies that might occur in the maniples. The light infantry consisted of 1,200 unarmored skirmishing troops drawn from the youngest and lower social classes. They were armed with a sword and a small shield, as well as several light javelins. Rome's military confederation with the other peoples of the Italian peninsula meant that half of Rome's army was provided by the Sassai, such as the Etruscans, Umbrians, Apulians, Campanians, Samnites, Lucani, Brutii, and the various southern Greek cities. Polybius states that Rome could draw on 770,000 men at the beginning of the Second Punic War, of which 700,000 were infantry and 70,000 met their requirements for cavalry. Rome's Italian allies would be organized in ali, or wings, roughly equal in manpower to the Roman legions, though with 900 cavalry instead of 300. A small navy had operated at a fairly low level after about 300, but it was massively upgraded about 40 years later, during the First Punic War. After a period of frenetic construction, the navy mushroomed to a size of more than 400 ships on the Carthaginian, Punic, pattern. Once completed, it could accommodate up to 100,000 sailors and embarked troops for battle. The navy thereafter declined in size. 247. The extraordinary demands of the Punic Wars, in addition to a shortage of manpower, exposed the tactical weaknesses of the Manipular Legion, at least in the short term. 248. In 217, near the beginning of the Second Punic War, Rome was forced to effectively ignore its long-standing principle that its soldiers must be both citizens and property owners. During the 2nd century, Roman territory saw an overall decline in population, 249, partially due to the huge losses incurred during various wars. This was accompanied by severe social stresses and the greater collapse of the middle classes. As a result, the Roman state was forced to arm its soldiers at the expense of the state, which it did not have to do in the past. The distinction between the heavy infantry types began to blur, perhaps because the state was now assuming the responsibility of providing standard issue equipment. In addition, the shortage of available manpower led to a greater burden being placed upon Rome's allies for the provision of allied troops. 250. Eventually, the Romans were forced to begin hiring mercenaries to fight alongside the legions. 251. Legion after the reforms of Gaius Marius. In a process known as the Marian Reforms, Roman consul Gaius Marius carried out a program of reform of the Roman military. 255. In 107, all citizens, regardless of their wealth or social class, were made eligible for entry into the Roman army. This move formalized and concluded a gradual process that had been growing for centuries, of removing property requirements for military service. 256. The distinction among three heavy infantry classes, which had already become blurred, had collapsed into a single class of Roman warrior. Fresco in Pompeii, c. 8020 BC. A Roman naval biome depicted in relief from the Temple of Fortuna Primigenia in Praeneste, 252, c. 120 BC. Winking sad smiley 253, now in the Museo Pio Clementino in the Vatican Museum's Temple of Janus as seen in the present Church of San Nicola in Castor, in the Forum Holatorium of Rome, Italy. Dedicated by Gaius Duilius after his naval victory at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, 254, heavy legionary infantry. The heavy infantry legionaries were drawn from citizen stock, while non-citizens came to dominate the ranks of thelite infantry. The Amish high-level officers and commanders were still drawn exclusively from the Roman aristocracy. 257. Unlike earlier in the Republic, legionaries were no longer fighting on a seasonal basis to protect the land. Instead, they received standard pay, and were employed by the state on a fixed-term basis. As a consequence, military duty began to appeal most to the poorest sections of society, to whom a salaried pay was attractive. A destabilizing consequence of this development was that the proletariat acquired a stronger and more elevated position. 258, within the state. The legions of the late Republic were almost entirely heavy infantry. The main legionary subunit was a cohort of approximately 480 infantrymen, further divided into 6 centuries of 80 men each. 259, each century comprised 10 tent groups of 8 men. Cavalry were used as scouts and dispatch riders, rather than as battlefield forces. 260, legions also contained a dedicated group of artillery crew of perhaps 60 men. Each legion was normally partnered with an approximately equal number of allied, non-Roman, troops. 261. The army's most obvious deficiency lay in its shortage of cavalry, especially heavy cavalry. 262, particularly in the east, Rome's slow-moving infantry legions were often confronted by fast-moving cavalry troops, and found themselves at a tactical disadvantage. Following Rome's subjugation of the Mediterranean, its navy declined in size, although it would undergo short-term upgrading and revitalization in the late Republic to meet several new demands. Julius